Okay, so we're going to begin. Welcome everyone to the lecture today. This lecture will be two-part. You will have two lecturers, myself and Dr. Angela Harutyunyan from the Fine Arts and Art History Department. So I will provide an introductory exposition of de Beauvoir's thinking, and in specific in relationship to the text that you will be looking at this week, after which Angela will... Hello? Okay, so after which Angela will provide an exposition of some kind of feminist art practices in the wake of de Beauvoir's propositions. Okay, so this week's author and your reading take us to a very pivotal moment of the 20th century. Simone de Beauvoir was writing in an intellectual and political milieu that was both highly formative for her thought and within which she made an undeniable mark by framing the field of feminist scholarship and politics. The context is France in the mid-20th century. The time is a moment in which leftist politics surged. For those of you who haven't heard of the student uprisings of 1968, they were going on at this time. De Beauvoir was engaged from the very beginning in both her literary and philosophic texts with responding to the historico-political events unfolding around her. At this time in France flourished at least three major schools of thought, all of which influenced her works: phenomenology and existentialism, that was largely influenced by Martin Heidegger's work, Marxism and structuralism, with figures like Louis Althusser, and works that reframed the classical antagonism between materialism and idealism in philosophy. And de Beauvoir was influenced by Kojève's lectures on Hegel at that time, and Merleau-Ponty's discussions, specifically in Humanism and Terror from 1947. So one of the main questions being debated in the various intellectual circles in France and in Europe was the question of the subject. Who is the subject of politics? Is it the subject of consciousness? Is it the subject that is reduced to biological life, sensations, and affects? Who is the subject of feminist politics? So if we begin from de Beauvoir's declaration, one is not born a woman but becomes a woman, we find that this sentence encapsulates her existentialist ethics that is based on the idea of existence ultimately preceding essence. So the subject in de Beauvoir's formulation, as we will see, is conceived or understood as one that is always constituted within and by a set of concrete socio-symbolic relations. There is no human nature, there is no first nature, and surely ethics and morality cannot be understood as a second nature if we cannot establish this first nature. So despite the many revisions and discussions of her formative text, The Second Sex, which you will be reading this week, de Beauvoir's book remains to be a foundational text for contemporary feminism. The book begins with the question, what is a woman? In this text, we see de Beauvoir putting into action her discursive strategy. She creates a place from within which to speak and write against the dominant discourse of Western capitalist culture. This dominant discourse was at the time satiated with representations of motherhood in post-war France, and the French state was aggressively promoting motherhood through economic incentives and moral appeals. In this context, de Beauvoir refused the questions as they were being posed. She rejected moralism, or as she put it, a quote from her, "Moralism was the last bastion of bourgeois idealism." Merleau-Ponty at this time had written a critique of liberal humanism and a defense of Marxism's principal materialist claim that the subject of consciousness, the abstract, self-interested individual, is indeed an ideological one. And in this text, Ponty placed the phenomenological subject close to a Marxist materialist one. This subject is not the one to be found either through empirical psychology, nor through an abstract transcendental consciousness, and it is certainly not reducible to the liberal bourgeois subject. It is a subject that is not the abstract subject of consciousness and moralism. Now, de Beauvoir, influenced by this thinking, identifies the subject of consciousness against which she is positing her critique, right? This is the subject of consciousness that she's arguing against as being ultimately a masculine subject. Masculinity and femininity do not for her refer to identities. They are not simple descriptions of subjects. Rather, masculinity is synonymous with this abstract subject. It is the positive and neutral pole, as she puts it. Man is both the definition of man and the human, both the homme and the homo of Homo sapien, while woman is the other, the negative pole that requires to be domesticated within the imaginary wholeness and identity of the masculine. By saying that the masculine and feminine are not identities but phenomenon that describe reality, analyzing these phenomenon fundamentally means a few things. On one hand, the problematization of the ideas of femininity, femaleness, as well as the problematization of sexuality and embodiment. So phenomenology, the method that de Beauvoir uses, is not some kind of introspective philosophy. It's not about the internal processes or activities of the human mind, but about the way in which we relate to the world and its beginnings. So the phenomenological question that Beauvoir poses about sex is not what is sex, but why is the sexual relation experienced as a difference and an opposition? Is this necessary? Can the experience have some other structure? Furthermore, what is the role of philosophy or thought in all of this? And this is a quote from her to understand further her, her engagement with thinking and with theory and philosophy. She says, "If a theory convinced me, it did not remain exterior to me. It changed my relation to the world, colored my experience. In short, I had a sound capacity to adopt, a critical sense to develop. For me, philosophy is a living reality." In this sense, her method of phenomenological suspension or bracketing is not simply about turning in towards oneself, but about becoming conscious of our relations with the world and others. The suspension, or the stepping out of the world to question it, is not about contesting the reality of the world, but about refusing to accept this reality as unproblematic and given. So the phenomenologist for de Beauvoir does not reject the reality of the world, but questions its mode of reality. It is in this sense that phenomenology seeks to abolish the opposition between subject and object, which you will see a lot of in the second sex. And again, another quote from de Beauvoir: "It is impossible to define an object apart from the subject by whom and for whom it is the object. And the subject reveals itself only in relation to the objects that it is engaged with." So the nature of de Beauvoir's engagement with philosophy, given the content and range also of her other literary writings, was a refusal to accept the construction of systems of philosophy and to reject what she called all finalities of history. This is a quote from her: "Neither system nor history could any more than the malicious demon cancel the living certainty of I am, I exist, at this place and moment, me." End of quote. So instead of system building, she emphasized the role of questioning, of problematizing, and of writing as a place in which intersubjectivity can be realized. Thus, de Beauvoir begins the second sex by asking, does women exist? Will they always exist? Is it desirable that they exist? And this isn't meant to question the reality of a woman's existence, but to ask, how does woman exist? Is her being real? What is reality when it is stated? She responds to these by making a first provisional argument. And I quote her: "Not every female human being is necessarily a woman. In order to be a woman, one must participate in the mysterious and threatened reality which is femininity." End of quote. So femaleness is necessary in a certain reality, but not a sufficient condition for making a woman for de Beauvoir. There is a separation in her writing between femaleness, femininity, and womanhood. She uses the concept of feminine existence, as she terms it, and not the concept of woman to describe the reality of femininity. She proceeds to deny any essence, any eternal, unchanging essence for femininity, in order to argue that it is a process of becoming. To be a woman is a process of becoming, as I quote her again, not a fixed reality, but a becoming. So this conception that she provides is ultimately anchored in the way she understood, or she provides an understanding for how we can think about the body. The living body for de Beauvoir, the body is not a given thing, but a way of relating to things, a way of acting and being affected in the world. So the feminine and the masculine are thus not different and fixed entities, but variations of human embodiment. To tell the truth, this is a quote from her, man, like woman, is flesh, and therefore a passivity. And she, like him, in the midst of her carnal fever, is a consenting, a voluntary gift, an activity. They live in their different ways the strange ambiguity of existence made body, end of quote. However, the relationship or the problem for de Beauvoir is that the relationship between man and woman is not symmetrical. He is the subject, she says, this is a quote from her, it's a very important quote, he is the absolute, she is the other. So woman is the product, for de Beauvoir, of a certain patriarchal mythology, a masculine ideology that exploits sexual difference to create systems of inequality. Equality, as she understood it, is not to be equal in the sense of sameness, but is one that must be accomplished despite difference. She argued that claims for equality risk erasing sexual difference in order to establish the masculine subject as the absolute human. And this is a long quote from her. Now, what peculiarly signalizes the situation of woman is that she, a free and autonomous being like all human creatures, nevertheless finds herself living in a world where men compel her to assume the status of the other. They propose to stabilize her as object, to doom her to immanence, since her transcendence is to be overshadowed and forever transcended by another ego, which is essential and sovereign. The drama of woman lies in this conflict between the fundamental aspirations of every subject, who always regards the self as the essential, and the compulsions of a situation in which she is the inessential. How can a human being in woman's situation attain fulfillment, she asks? What roads are open to her? Which are blocked? How can independence be recovered in a state of dependency? What circumstances limit woman's liberty, and how can they be overcome? These are the fundamental questions, she says, on which she would fain throw some light. This means, de Beauvoir, at the end of the quote, I am interested in the fortunes of the individual as defined not in terms of happiness, but in terms of liberty, end of quote. So by saying that woman is the other, de Beauvoir employed a somewhat quasi-Hegelian understanding of this dialectical relationship between the self and the other that is based on a certain structure of negation. The self needs to be recognized by the other in the process of development of consciousness. A quote from de Beauvoir, otherness is a fundamental category of human thought. The other in this process, as she argues, is reduced to the self-same, does not have any alterity or authentic specificity. Another way to think of the self-other question is the master-slave relation. The master, or man, is assumed to have absolute knowledge, being the absolute subject, while the slave has to work and labor without knowledge. The slave is both subjected and also actively shapes her own nature. Her own natural inclinations are shaped through the work of the slave, through labor, or for de Beauvoir, through reproduction, through reproductive labor. This is why her foremost critique is directed against the supposed naturalness of motherhood. Refusing maternity and motherhood as what is enforced on the subject, de Beauvoir complicates and refuses the monolithic notion of maternal desire as the essence of femaleness. Her aim with this move is to destabilize the masculine idea of a mother. In the second sex, the familiar figure of the mother, when you read it, becomes this uncanny figure of the maternal. In fact, she argues that this enforced maternality splits the female subject internally. The maternal body is the site within which the species somehow takes residence, in the subject's body. And first, enforced maternity through this containment of female desire by patriarchal law calls forth a subject whose desire is meant to coincide with her natural calling. The fetus, as such, is seen as something that is parasitical, and she uses this term, as what robs the woman of her entity, as the species taking residence in the subject's body. So a quote from her, the species takes residence in the woman's body and asserts itself against her separateness. This is a quote from her. This war between woman and the species begins with coitus. A quote from de Beauvoir, first violated, the female is then alienated, she becomes in part another than herself, end of quote. De Beauvoir purposefully adopts this terminology of reproductive biology, parasites, eggs, fetuses, and etc., in order to amplify the absurdity of male utterances in physiology and biology that deduce the reproductive function of the female from that of an egg. A quote from de Beauvoir, the egg is imagined to be a little female, the woman a giant egg, end of quote. So the point for de Beauvoir was to render comical, this kind of exaggeration, to render comical what appears to be a scientific certitude, an evidence for deducing the woman's place as being in the home. The maternal body, in which the physician, priest, and the philosopher have inscribed the supposed blissful coexistence of the mother and child to be, was actually portrayed by de Beauvoir as a site of struggle. And this is her discursive strategy consistently. So further, she argued that patriarchy has to affirm the mother as a subject to secure the humanist idea of the subject. So for her, the mother as a subject is a complete illusion because she is deprived of speech. She is the mute, phallic mother of infantile fantasy and the mute, loving mother of masculinist representation. Ultimately, de Beauvoir presents us with an understanding of the body as a historical idea and not a natural fact. It is not a question of what human female is or what the maternal body is, but what has humanity made of the female. So she inscribes conflict consistently in this manner by raising such questions. What is staged in her denaturalization of motherhood is a war between the woman and the species, a refusal to define the female subject by her reproductive capacity. So for de Beauvoir, the female body has a material reality but no intrinsic essential meaning apart from the discourses of gender. Thus, and in agreement with psychoanalysis, and you've read Freud in this course, de Beauvoir understood the materiality of the body as what is lived by the subject. To quote her again, it is not the body object described by biologists that actually exists, but the body as lived by the subject, end of quote. Thus, the burden of maternity on a woman is not simply the child to be inside her abdomen, but it is patriarchy. So what is in the belly for de Beauvoir is patriarchy. It is the name of the father. It is the cultural and socio-symbolic meaning of the species called man, the homo of Homo sapien. So her discursive strategy, her constant railing against maternity, pregnancy, childhood, and reproductive labor, and her expression of disgust and horror, the terms that she uses, are meant to stage a confrontation between man and his other. She can be seen to exaggerate the description of the existence of the other, this woman, that mother figure that becomes this uncanny, disgusting sight of struggle, to the extent that it becomes so horrible that what upholds the self, the absolute self, the masculine position, comes to be threatened. This is the strategy that she's using. So masculine subjectivity itself is what she is, trying to unmoor. De Beauvoir argues that the male dread or horror from the female body is a fear of his own imminence, of his own corporeal limitations, the fear of becoming a woman, a fear of the mother. This fear is projected outside the self, and this is why the woman must be constituted as other, as an externalized difference, not an internalized one. So her most important contribution, de Beauvoir, is an alternative theory of subjectivity that is in fact a materialist one. By analyzing motherhood and the maternal ideal as places within which the woman is a non-subject, Beauvoir reminds us that in order to counter the patriarchal order, the position of woman within it must be altered. Her most important contribution is that sexual identity is in no way determined by a biological mechanism, but is learned through dynamics of identification and implicated in a system of production that is specific to modern capitalism. What Beauvoir early on was aware of is that the socialist revolutions that had already happened had not yet succeeded in emancipating women from patriarchy, and that indeed there cannot be a social revolution without the emancipation of women. And I want to end my part of the lecture with a selection from an interview with her 25 years after the publication of The Second Sex to show her kind of combative mode of thinking. This is de Beauvoir. This consciousness among women that the class struggle does not embody the sex struggle is what is new in the wake of feminism, as she proposed it. Yet most women in the struggle know that now. That's the greatest achievement of the feminist movement. It's one which will alter history in the years to come. And her interviewer asks, but such a consciousness is limited to women who are in the left, that is, women who are committed to the restructuring of the whole of society. And what does Beauvoir answer? She says, well, of course, since the rest are conservative, meaning they want to conserve what has been or what is. Women on the right do not want revolution. They are mothers, wives, devoted to their men. Or if they are agitators at all, they want a bigger piece of the pie. They want to earn more, elect more women to parliament, see a woman become president. They fundamentally believe in inequality, except they want to be on top rather on the bottom. But they will fit fine into the system as it is or as it will change a bit to accommodate such demands. Capitalism can certainly afford to allow women to join an army, allow women to join a police force. Capitalism is certainly intelligent enough to let more women join the government. Pseudo-socialism can certainly allow women to become Secretary General of its party. Those are just reforms, like social security or paid vacations. Did the institutionalization of paid vacations change the inequality of capitalism? Did the right of women to work in factories at equal pay to the men change the male orientation of the Czech society, for instance? But to change the whole value system of either society, to destroy the concept of motherhood, this is de Beauvoir, that is revolutionary. Okay, so I leave you with this, and you'll have the second part of the lecture now.
Hello, everyone. So in the remaining 25 minutes today, I'll sketch out some of the trajectories for feminist art practice that de Beauvoir's second sex opened in the 60s, 70s, and beyond. And I will sketch out this reception in terms of two problematics posed by de Beauvoir's book, which became foundation for the post-1960s feminist art practice that was artistic, political, and theoretical at once. The 60s second wave feminism, unlike the first wave feminism that in the early 20th century that focused on equal rights for voting, the suffrage rights for women, the second wave feminism came to challenge social, economic, and cultural inequalities between the sexes and posed questions regarding reproductive rights, the ownership of the body, and women's representation in the public sphere and her cultural representation via the newly constituted, what we could call society of spectacle, the commodity culture and consumerism. So the two lines of inquiry opened up by de Beauvoir and most pertinently taken up by feminist art practices are, I argue, one, household labor and social reproduction, and number two, the subject-object binary with the body as a threshold that enacts this performative opposition, or non-opposition, as Dr. Bou-Ali has argued. Rather than constructing a comprehensive survey or providing a certain genealogical development from de Beauvoir to what came to be categorized as second wave feminism, I found a few key examples in relation to the propositions stemming from the second sex. The artworks here are not meant to illustrate a theory, but in and of themselves are conceived as interventions in art history as well as in theory and radical politics. One could argue that de Beauvoir was the first to pose the problem of sex as a philosophical problem. The second sex attempts to offer a corrective to philosophy's partial universality, since it has traditionally failed to account for woman's being. The woman's being is as much a philosophical problem as it is a social one, and can neither be subsumed under the category of class or anti-colonial struggle, though it shares historical affinities with both, in terms of the fact of oppression. Then why can't we apply class analysis to women's condition of oppression in order to tackle this condition? We can apply class analysis only partially, according to de Beauvoir. The peculiarity of being a sexed human being for de Beauvoir means a certain interface between biology and culture, neither reduced to one nor to the other. And yet, the very arguments of biological justifications of sexual difference and oppression, according to her, are only historically constituted. In short, biology is constructed by culture, while the cultural rhetoric of biological determinism works towards naturalizing history. Given that sex is an interface between nature and culture, the work of a new philosophy that recognizes sex not to privilege the particular, the subject of sexual difference historically recognized as woman, over the universal, philosophy, man's claim to transcendence, etc., but to argue for a true universality that can be achieved only if women are on par with men and are as much subjects of history as its objects. And this very project of asking the philosophical question, what is a woman entails a new form of politics that before was not recognized or possible. Despite the subsequent misappropriations and misreadings of the second sex, the book is not a Bible of feminist philosophy or feminist social theory. To read the second sex as a forerunner of feminist philosophy entails two kinds of fallacies. Firstly, it would reduce the Beauvoir's text to an argument for particularity of gender identity, while she was after the universal. And secondly, it would mean to assume that she has the subject of her theory at hand, the woman, on whose behalf she would advocate. But that very subject was missing. She says, and I quote, "We don't know any longer whether women still exist, if they will always exist, if it's necessary or not to wish for their existence, what place they occupy in the world, what place they should occupy there. What is a woman?" End of the quote. It is not that the woman can be made visible through the labor of conceptualization or pinning down her place historically or constructing her as an object of knowledge before a proper philosophy of woman is born, but the task of philosophy that asks the question of the being of the woman is precisely to problematize that very existence, to write of it as a void that cannot be filled or fulfilled. And this does not mean that women should be denied existence that they have been deprived of, but the Beauvoir's is a call to historicize and theorize the place of that existence in the constitution of the woman as other. So after these general remarks, let's go to the two approaches that I sketched as themes that have been taken up by feminist art practices in the 60s. The first one is labor, sex, and social reproduction. So the Beauvoir's philosophical project is ultimately a political one, following Marx, who famously said, philosophers had hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. And if for Marx the political task was to make the proletariat visible as a subject of history, for the Beauvoir in the mid-20th century, the woman shares a similar invisibility with the working class in the 19th century. So the second sexist philosophical project is based on the understanding that previous theories and practices of liberation cannot be fully applied to women. If the goal of the proletariat in its historical struggle of appropriation of the means and outcomes of labor is to abolish the bourgeoisie and itself as a class, and if, in the radical rendering, the goal of the colonized people is to kill the colonial oppressor, women's liberation cannot pass through the abolition of men. Though actually in some radical feminist practices of the late 60s, for example, Valerie Solanas wrote this manifesto called the SCUM, which meant the Society for Cutting Up Men, but these were exceptions. So the Beauvoir says, the bond that unites her to her oppressors is not comparable to any other. The division of the sexes is a biological fact, not an event in human history. Male and female stand opposed within a primordial Mitsein, a bridge, and woman has not broken it. The couple is a fundamental unity with its two halves riveted together, and the cleavage of society along the line of sex is impossible. Here is to be found the basic trait of woman. She is the other in a totality of which the two components are necessary to one another. End of quote. So the women's particular historical situatedness, the spaces they inhabit, and the kind of labor they perform, predominantly confined to the domestic sphere, do not allow for an advent of something akin to class consciousness. In the 19th century, for Marx, industrial capitalism allowed for collectivization of labor, for hundreds and thousands of men and women to share the space of work, and through this shared space, also experience alienation collectively. One of the shared conditions in spaces of collective labor, possibilities out of these shared conditions, possibilities of mobilization would arise that would overturn the conditions of oppression. Unlike the proletariat that would develop class consciousness through the shared experience of work, women's primary site of labor is the household, a private and isolated sphere of the bourgeois individual reproduction wherein work does not appear as labor, that is, as value-generating activity or as wage labor, but as a set of tasks performed on the grounds of emotional attachment, love, caring, and so on. De Beauvoir says, I quote, "We have seen what poetic veils are thrown over her monotonous burdens of housekeeping and maternity. In exchange for her liberty, she has received the false treasures of her femininity." End of quote. Here, the commodity's mystical veil reappears as a veil of her femininity, as a romantic and quasi-mystical, metaphysical construct. This veiling of labor via the ideology of femininity is especially present in the history of art as a discipline whose primary occupation since the 19th century has been the construction of the patrilineage of style and influence, leading from one genius male artist to another. From Leonardo, Michelangelo, Titian, Raphael, and so on and so forth, to Manet, Picasso, etc. Here, hence the story goes. And feminist theory and practice of the late 60s and 70s came to revisit and revise the canon of art history. This canon is constituted by this succession of geniuses and masterworks. And to ask the question of who and why has been included and who and why has been excluded from the Leonardo to Jackson Pollock pantheon. In a 1972 essay, art historian Linda Nochlin famously asked, "Why have there been no great women artists?" And the answer was not to excavate and find great women artists who were neglected and forgotten by this male canon, though this was and is being done as well, but to question the ideology of genius and greatness on the one hand, and situate the very question historically, in terms of the conditions of women within the institution of pre-modern and then bourgeois family. Nochlin instead asks, did women historically have access to art education, and more specifically to anatomy, to the naked body and the dissected corpse? Ultimately, it was anatomical drawing, after all, that became one of the key conditions of mastery in painting since the Renaissance. If the material conditions and the patriarchal family relations did not permit women's entrance to art academies and artists' workshops, how could there be great women artists? Ultimately, greatness is not a natural given, but it's a historical construct. So, greatness does not spring somewhere from the soul or is biologically determined, but is a category constructed by social institutions, and amongst them, art history. So the feminist theory of the 60s and 70s was an era with two main targets. First of all, they aimed to undo what was perceived as a biased distinction between so-called low culture, popular mass culture, and high art, such as painting, sculpture, where both process and the body are veiled behind the final artwork, by addressing the question of artists' labor and making that labor visible. And number two, they aim to make visible the unspoken and unseen labor of women in the household. So on the one hand, you have artistic labor that has been previously veiled, and on the other hand, making visible the woman's domestic labor in the public sphere. So in the sharp distinctions that modern art drew between non-purposeful autonomous high artworks and utilitarian objects, high art being a place of freedom where artist supposedly expresses his subjectivity, calling for an aesthetic experience that has nothing to do with other kinds of interested and partial interests of everyday life. The male painter whose sexuality is veiled behind the myth of his status as a master of intentionality, who produces artworks that reflect his unique soul, revealed in the unrepeatable painterly mark. So in a sense, all these romantic notions of art as an expression of one's soul, one's spirit, one's intentions, is a product of this modern period. We should also not forget that this is the immediate period following American abstract expressionism of the 50s that used sexualized metaphors in its production of the male painter as a heroic and virile subject of absolute freedom. For example, Jackson Pollock's paintings were called ejaculatory artworks, and I'll talk about this in a moment. As opposed to this, female labor has been historically designated to the production of crafts and utilitarian objects. These, unlike paintings that supposedly mark transcendence from the banality of everyday life, are confined to the world of necessity and need. So the sites of female labor, housework, reproduction, production of crafts became sites of intervention for artists who declared that personal is political. In 1972, Californian artist Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro opened Woman House, a collective space for cohabiting, educating, thinking, and exhibiting. The exhibition that they staged in the same year was conceived as a performative rite of passage, of becoming a woman, with multiple rooms called nursery, nurturer's kitchen, menstruation room, and sheet closet. The visitor participant would be led through the space where women were performing everyday acts that make up womanhood. These performances created a total environment that fused ritualistic theater with everyday gendered tasks. On the one hand, they denaturalized women's everyday labor by staging it as a theatrical activity, and on the other hand, challenged the idea that art is a detached object for contemplation. Here, the woman's artist's body made visible was conceived as an attack on the status of art as a self-sufficient, autonomous object displayed in the seemingly neutral space of the museum and producing a unique aesthetic experience. Judy Chicago's 1974-79 work called The Dinner Party staged yet another assault on the art historical and intellectual canon. This monumental work, that took obviously 5 years to make, comprised an installation of a large triangular table that served as femage to 999 women in history, as opposed to homage. The Last Supper honored famous and infamous, neglected, forgotten, and erased artists, writers, composers, philosophers, goddesses. The more prominent amongst them had a seat at the dinner table, covered with a handmade tablecloth and porcelain floral and vulval forms, symbolizing the guests. And this is Georgia O'Keeffe's table, a Mexican-American artist. An American artist from the South, sorry. The rest had their names inscribed on porcelain tiles, composing the base of the table. This matrilineage served for reclaiming women as subjects of history and representation through labor traditionally ascribed to women: sewing, knitting, pottery making, and so on. Another artist who consistently engaged with the question of labor in the 60s and 70s as a means of institutional critique, critiquing the institutions of family and high art alike, was Mirle Lederman Ukeles. In a 1969 manifesto called Maintenance Art Manifesto, she writes, I quote, "Development, pure intellectual creation, the new, change, progress, advance, excitement, fight or fleeing. Maintenance, keep the dust off the pure individual creation, preserve the new, sustain the change, protect progress, defend and prolong the advance, renew the excitement, repeat the flight." End of the quote. By bringing the key Enlightenment category, development, and the tedious work of maintenance together, Ukeles pointed at maintenance that goes into keeping alive the pillars of modernity, the ideas of change, progress, and the new. Ultimately, she enacted a series of performances where she cleaned the floors and stairs of museums for set hours. She referred to these activities as floor paintings, and the collected dust arranged in a display case were named dust paintings. Here we do not only have the intrusion of domestic labor onto the space of the museum performed by a woman who is an artist, but also the very labor that goes into maintaining spaces that house products of high culture is made visible. The maintenance of the display case would normally be the janitor's responsibility, but once made a work of art, it enters the territory of the conservator. In Chicago's and Ukeles' works, the critique of the institutional conditions of art, museums, and their politics of representation, which means who enters to the museum, who is left out, is not separable from the critique of the institutional structures of patriarchy, including its seemingly most neutral spheres, the domestic sphere. In Chicago's work, if Chicago's work still preserves the bourgeois ideology of genius and the individual artist as ideals preserved by the art museum, though she reverses this by constructing a pantheon for women rather than for men. Eukeles offers a double critique of the sphere of domesticity and the art institution. But these two artists' work point to an assumption that the logic of repetition is not confined to the industrial production of commodities, but includes tedious domestic labor as well. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, maintaining. Dr. Bou-Ali mentioned the centrality of the question of subject and the object binary for Simone de Beauvoir. And it was precisely this question that became paradigmatic for the 1970s theory and art practice that took up psychoanalysis as a weapon against patriarchy and against psychoanalysis' own biases towards the masculine subject. Mary Kelly's durational work, completed over the course of 6 years, entitled Postpartum Document, documents the birth and development of her son through a double narrative: the child's entry to history, language and social institutions, and the mother's loss of her son to these institutions, as the child becomes separated from the mother. Using the tools provided by psychoanalysis, Kelly's ethnographic theoretical investigation centered on the possibility of female fetishism. She meticulously collected and presented the residues of her child as indexes of this fetishism, female fetishism. Diapers, scribbles, clothes, first writings, and so on. Numerous charts, graphs, theoretical reflections combined with these emblems of the mother's desire point at the domestic labor of sexual reproduction as an intrinsic part of social reproduction, including the production of desire through lack. This archaeology of the everyday, in Kelly's own words, debunks the double myth of the artist's genius who effaces the traces of work and the labor of sexual reproduction as non-work. But in addition, Kelly's deep investment in Lacanian theory and psychoanalytic theory claims this traditionally masculine domain for the female artist. And here, we arrived at the second thematic that I identified in feminist art practice of the 60s and 70s that has been opened up by de Beauvoir's The Second Sex: the subject and object binary in the question of recognition and embodiment. In the 1970s, body art practices most productively engaged with the subject and object binary. The body here acted not only as a site upon which the patriarchal violence is enacted, and patriarchal does not mean the rule of men, but the rule of the father, but also as a means to challenge the politics of representation within the canon of art history, where women were seen as objects of representation whose bodies had been pacified via idealization by predominantly male artists. And of course, we have the classical genre of the nude painting that became the crux of the attack by feminist artists. Here, artists such as Shigeko Kubota, Karoli Schneemann, Hanna Wilke, and Vito Acconci, amongst others, used their own bodies in performances, video installations, and photographic series as works of art. In these works, the subject who represents and the object of representation, what is represented, are not oppositional to and separate from one another. The artist is the subject who makes the artwork. Her body is the material for making art, and this body constitutes the artwork itself. Kubota's 1965 performance called Vagina Painting, where the artist makes an abstract expressionist work by a dangled brush coming out of her crotch, is a commentary on abstract expressionist painting of the 50s, and particularly on Jackson Pollock, who I already mentioned. Pollock would position his canvas horizontally and drip paint on it via positioning his body performatively in relation to the canvas. Unlike Pollock's work, where the very result, the painting, has been made sacred in the museological order of modern art, as he was hailed by Life magazine as the greatest American painter as early as 1949, in Kubota's work, it is the ephemeral and durational performance that constitutes the work of art rather than the end result. And actually, she is explicitly sexing this process of making the artwork. Schneemann's 1975 performance, Karoli Schneemann, similarly brings in the sexed and partial subject as both an object and subject of representation. In her performance, Interior Scroll, philosopher, art historian, artist, and filmmaker Schneemann pulls a paper scroll out of her vagina, while reading philosophical texts from it. In this, the subject and object binaries, the woman as belonging to nature, to immanence, as opposed to the transcendental male artist, the philosopher, are undone. They are enacted performatively via the intersection of the body and the world, the self and the other. As an object of desire who puts her naked body in front of the audience, Schneemann is also a desiring subject who performs transcendence as a philosopher, as an artist, as a so-called master of intentionality, as a male in drag. In short, the Beauvoir's second text opened up avenues for feminist praxis that throughout the 60s and 70s women's liberation movement and beyond challenged the authority of normative discourses, institutional values, and the politics of representation. In feminist art practice in particular, it is not politics as a theme that became an object to be represented, but representation itself was conceived as a political act. And I will leave you with this image by Guerrilla Girls and a collective of anonymous women artists who intervened in the structures of museums, of galleries, in biennials via making posters that challenge the representation of women in the art institutional context. Thank you.